Ethan Walker stared at his laptop screen for nearly 5 whole minutes without clicking the mouse. Not because the email was long, but because he was afraid that if he reread it, it might disappear. Northbridge Capital Group cordially invites. A short, polite line, but to Ethan, it felt like a door cracking open after years of standing outside the hallway. The annual gala. Black tie. Reserved only for senior leadership, strategic partners, and those who truly belong here. Ethan leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. His heart was beating faster than usual. 34 years old, 7 years with the company. The last 3 years have been with almost no weekends. And finally, he was being seen. In Ethan's world, being seen mattered more than being understood. Because he grew up in an environment where, if you didn't look successful, no one had time to listen to your story. He was born in a quiet suburb where men always spoke louder than necessary, where everyone was afraid of being seen as not enough. His father used to say, adjusting his cheap tie in front of the mirror, "You have to make people think you're important before they decide to treat you that way." Ethan carried that sentence with him into adulthood, not as a lesson, but as a survival instinct. That email wasn't just an invitation. It was confirmation that all the silence, all the evenings spent forcing smiles at jokes that weren't funny, all the swallowed pride, had meaning. He stood up and stepped away from the small work corner by the window of their Manhattan apartment. "Elena!" he called out, trying to keep his voice casual. In the kitchen, Elena was cooking. The smell of hot soup blended with the soft scent of herbs in the air. She turned around, wiped her hands on a towel, her eyes gentle as always. "What is it?" she asked. Ethan turned the laptop screen toward her, unable to hide his smile. "I've been invited to the company gala." Elena leaned in, reading slowly. Then she smiled. "So they've recognized you." There was no jealousy in her voice, no pressure. Just pure happiness for the man she loved. But Ethan shook his head slightly. "It's more than that," he said. "This is an opportunity." Elena tilted her head. "An opportunity for what?" Ethan searched for the words. He couldn't quite explain the feeling in his chest, the sense that if that night went perfectly, his life would shift onto a different path. "An opportunity for them to see that I truly belong there." Elena nodded, but in her eyes there was something faint. Not doubt, but intuition. She turned back to the stove and continued stirring the soup. "Then I guess you'll need a new tuxedo." "Yeah," Ethan replied quickly. "And you'll come with me." Elena turned around, surprised. "Me?" "Yes, it's a couples gala." Elena smiled, a small, warm smile. "That sounds nice." In that moment, Ethan looked at her, and for a brief second, he remembered why he fell in love with her in the first place. Elena had never tried to be loud. She never tried to impress. She existed entirely, without taking up anyone else's space. That calm presence was what once made Ethan feel safe. But now, it made him uneasy. He leaned against the kitchen counter, lowering his voice as if discussing something practical. "There's just one small thing," he said. "Don't misunderstand." Elena stopped stirring. "What is it?" Ethan avoided her gaze. "You know, my company environment. Those people, they judge very quickly." Elena waited. "I just think you should dress a little more simply. Nothing too eye-catching." Elena looked at him, saying nothing at first. "I mean, modest," Ethan added quickly. "You're always beautiful when you're simple." Some words, when placed incorrectly, take on a different meaning. Elena understood that. She nodded gently. "All right." Ethan exhaled, not realizing how tense his chest had been. Then he continued, as if it were just a minor detail. "Oh, And when we get there, if anyone asks, just let me do the talking. Elena turned fully toward him. Let you say what? Ethan waved his hand. It's nothing serious. I just might introduce you a little differently. The atmosphere in the kitchen shifted. The smell of soup disappeared. Only silence remained. Differently how? Elena asked, her voice still calm. Ethan frowned. I don't want to explain too much about my personal life. Just for one night. Elena looked at him, her eyes not angry, just clear. You mean, introduce me as not your wife? Ethan stiffened. Don't make this more dramatic than it is. I'm just saying you help me out at home. A beat, then another. Help you out at home. How? Elena asked. Ethan sighed, irritation creeping into his voice. You know what I mean. I'm trying to build a future for both of us. It's just one night. Elena set the spoon down. Ethan, she said slowly, do you know what you're asking me to do? He avoided her eyes. You're asking me to make you feel safe, she continued, by making myself look smaller. The words landed between them, not loud, but heavy. Ethan shook his head. You're overthinking it. I just need you to help me a little. Elena fell silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had just realized something important. The man in front of her didn't know he was diminishing someone. To him, it was simply a strategy. Finally, she nodded. If that's what you need. Ethan smiled, relieved. Thank you. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought about the man who once asked her real questions, who listened without interrupting, who saw her as a person, not a role. She whispered, quiet enough that only she could hear. One day, you'll see me. But that night, Ethan was dreaming of bright lights, applause, and a version of himself he believed the world would finally accept. The week before the gala passed faster than Ethan expected, not because time was short, but because his mind was always racing ahead of the present, as if his entire body were already living inside an evening that had not yet arrived. He bought a new tuxedo in Midtown, black, perfectly tailored. More expensive than he usually allowed himself, but this time, Ethan didn't see it as a luxury. He saw it as an investment. Every evening he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar, tying the bow tie slowly, not to look better, but to grow accustomed to the image of someone who belonged there. Elena observed everything from a distance. She didn't ask how much the suit cost. She didn't ask who he would meet. She didn't ask why he needed to be so perfect. Not because she didn't care, but because she was listening to what was not being said. Some changes don't require explanations. They show themselves in the way someone walks through the house, in how they look at their phone more than at the person in front of them, in how they begin to see another person's presence as something that needs to be managed. One evening, Elena asked softly, "What should I wear?" Ethan was adjusting his tie, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "That beige dress," he said. "The long one you wear to church." Elena nodded. "Do you think it suits the occasion?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Neat, proper, doesn't draw attention." She was silent for a few seconds. "Not drawing attention, is that a good thing or a bad thing?" she asked. Ethan exhaled, slightly impatient. "You know what I mean." Elena didn't respond. She walked into the bedroom and opened the closet. Inside were dresses she had worn while giving presentations, blouses she had chosen carefully for essential meetings, shoes that had carried her through rooms filled with assessing eyes. She closed the closet. That night, Elena lay in bed with her back to Ethan. He fell asleep quickly. The sleep of someone who believed he was doing the right thing. She, however, remained awake. She thought about the way Ethan used the word simple as a shield, about how he framed her shrinking as support, and about how, in his effort not to be looked down on, he had unconsciously chosen someone to stand lower than himself. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. She just felt cold. The gala night arrived. New York City draped itself in a particular kind of glamour. The streets gleamed as if they had been polished in advance. Lights reflected off car windows, building facades, and the faces of people hurrying past one another. Elena stood in front of the mirror, wearing a cream-colored dress, a simple design, clean, elegant lines, nothing showy, yet it radiated quiet self-possession. She fastened small gold earrings and tied her hair neatly back. Ethan stepped out of the room and looked her over. He said. Looks fine. Just 2 words. Not praise, not criticism. Elena smiled, very faintly. Thank you. The car ride to the hotel was almost silent. Ethan rehearsed introductions in his head, handshakes, smiles timed just right. Elena looked out the window. She wasn't thinking about the party. She was thinking about the moment when people begin to see another person's existence as something that needs to be controlled. When the car stopped, camera flashes went off. The door was opened by an attendant who bowed politely. Ethan stepped out first, adjusting his collar. Elena followed, her heels touching the marble floor, making soft, restrained sounds. Remember what I said, Ethan whispered without looking at her. Smile, be polite. Don't attract attention. Elena nodded. Of course. He reached for her hand, then pulled it back when he saw a group of colleagues approaching. Ethan! Finally get to see you. Ethan walked quickly toward them, leaving Elena a step behind, not because he meant to, but because in his mind, that was the natural position. Inside the ballroom, everything glowed. Crystal chandeliers, soft jazz music, laughter just loud enough to sound refined. Ethan blended in quickly. His smile was wider than usual. His voice was louder than usual. Elena stood beside him, quiet. When a man asked, his gaze lingering on her a moment longer than politeness allowed, "And you are?" Ethan smiled. "Oh, Elena. She helps me take care of things at home." 1 second, then polite laughter followed. Elena kept smiling, not stiff, not forced, but there are smiles learned very early in life, the kind used to hide the fact that you have just been made smaller in front of others. She excused herself and walked toward the bar. Passing a large mirror, Elena stopped. The woman in the reflection looked composed, elegantly dressed. Her eyes were deep and steady. Nothing in that image suggested smallness. And it was precisely that realization that set something in her into motion. The evening continued like a well-rehearsed performance. Ethan talked about work, about the projects he had been involved in, about future visions. Elena stood at the edge, listening, observing. She wasn't jealous. She wasn't sad. She felt like she was watching a film she once belonged to but no longer had a role in. A young woman approached with a friendly smile. "Excuse me," she said. "Your necklace is beautiful." Elena touched the necklace lightly. "Thank you," she replied. "It belonged to my mother." The woman paused. "Oh, I'm sorry." Elena nodded. They chatted for a moment. Brief, light, natural. The woman looked at Elena with mild surprise. "Do you work in this field?" she asked. Elena smiled. "You could say that." Across the room, Ethan noticed them, and for the first time that evening, he felt uneasy. Not because Elena had done anything wrong, but because she didn't need him to exist in that space. He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Could you get me another drink?" he asked. Elena turned back toward him. The smile was still on her lips, but her eyes had changed. "All right." She walked away. Someone whispered behind him, "Is she really the help?" Ethan forced a smile. "Yeah, something like that." When Elena returned and set the glass down on the table, Ethan felt the distance. Not a physical distance, but something that had quietly withdrawn, permanently. She didn't look at him for long. She only said softly, "Here you go." Then she turned away. And in that moment, Ethan didn't realize that what he was losing wasn't other people's respect. It was the sense of safety in the eyes of the only person who had ever looked at him without judgment. The evening continued as if nothing were out of the ordinary. The music played on steadily. Champagne glasses were filled, then emptied again. Handshakes continued, on cue, in the right places. Only Ethan could no longer remain steady within himself. He smiled, but no longer felt joy. He spoke, but could no longer hear his own voice. Part of him was still standing in a moment from a few minutes earlier, the moment Elena set the glass down on the table, said, "Here you go," and walked away without waiting for a response. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was a withdrawal. And Ethan had never been afraid of that. Until now. He kept moving from group to group, like someone afraid that standing still would make him transparent. Every story he told lasted longer than it needed to. Every laugh lingered just a fraction too long. No one around him noticed. Or they noticed but didn't care. In this room, everyone was busy performing their role. A middle-aged man named Collins, a senior partner Ethan was eager to impress, stood near the bar. Ethan approached, his heart racing. "Collins," he said, trying to sound natural. "It's an honor to meet you." Collins turned, offering a thin smile. "Ethan, right?" "Yes, that's me." "I believe I heard your name mentioned in a meeting recently." That sentence immediately lifted Ethan's spirits. "Yes," he replied quickly. "The West Coast expansion project. I contributed some behind-the-scenes analysis." Collins raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" "I recall Whitmore saying there was an external consultant who helped restructure the ethical investment framework." Ethan forced a smile. "Possibly," he said, "but I believe I played a significant role as well." Collins nodded, not arguing, but something in his eyes closed off. "Interesting," he said. "We'll talk more later." Then he walked away. Ethan stood there holding his drink, feeling as though he'd been left in the middle of an unfinished sentence. He turned, searching for Elena. She was standing near the balcony, speaking with the young woman from earlier. The way she listened made the other person feel respected. The way she responded wasn't showy, but it was enough to make people want to ask more. Ethan felt a wave of heat rise in his neck. Not jealousy, not anger, but the fear of being replaced. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Elena's shoulder, slightly firmer than necessary. "Could you help me with something?" he asked. Elena turned to him. "What is it?" "I need another drink." The air between them froze for a brief instant, so short no one else noticed. Then Elena nodded. "All right." She walked away, her posture straight, unhurried. The woman standing beside Ethan tilted her head and lowered her voice. "She's very graceful." "Does she really work for you?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Yes," he said. "She helps me a great deal." The woman nodded, though her eyes still held doubt. When Elena returned, Ethan sensed something had changed. Not in how she stood, but in how she no longer searched for his eyes. She placed the glass down. "Here you go." Her tone was neutral, no reproach, no intimacy. Ethan wanted to say something, to fix it, to explain, but he didn't know where to begin, and this room did not allow truth to surface. Elena walked away, standing in a quieter corner. There she heard whispers. That's her? The one he said was the help? Really? She carries herself very differently. Elena kept her posture straight, didn't turn around, didn't react. But each sentence brushed lightly against an old wound, the wound of being judged before being known. She took a deep breath, not to endure, but to observe. Across the room, Ethan was laughing loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. That laughter reminded Elena of something very clearly. He hadn't always laughed like that. He used to listen. He used to know when to be silent. He used to look at her as a person, not as a tool to adjust his image. Elena didn't blame him, but she no longer shielded him in her own mind. That was the difference. Dinner was served. The scent of food filled the air, blending with expensive perfume. Ethan sat at the table, still the center of conversation. You look like you own the room tonight, a colleague teased. Ethan smiled. Maybe one day I will. Elena sat one seat away from him. She didn't join in, not because she wasn't invited, but because she no longer felt the need. At that moment, the entire room shifted. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. Attention turned toward the entrance. The CEO had arrived. Richard Northbridge entered with an unhurried, confident stride, like someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Graying hair, a measured smile, eyes that observed quickly but deeply. People stood up instinctively. Ethan nearly sprang to his feet. Sir, he said as he caught the CEO's gaze. It's an honor. Northbridge nodded politely. Good evening, Ethan. Then his eyes passed over Elena. Just 1 second. But in that moment, something unusual occurred. Not curiosity, not a social courtesy, but recognition. Elena inclined her head slightly. Northbridge nodded back, almost unnoticed. Enjoy your evening, he said, then moved on. Ethan turned to Elena, whispering with excitement. Did you see that? He knows who I am. Elena didn't respond. She watched Northbridge walk away, her expression calm. The music resumed. Couples began to dance. Ethan stood and looked around. He didn't invite Elena. You probably don't like this kind of thing, he said. Just relax. Then he turned and asked a colleague's wife to dance. Elena remained where she was. The balcony doors were open, the city stretching below like a canvas of light. She stood there, one hand resting lightly on the railing, looking down at streets where people hurried past one another, unaware of each other's lives. She wasn't sad, she wasn't angry, she was simply clear. At that moment, Elena felt someone watching her. She turned. Richard Northbridge stood not far away, looking at her with a very slight smile. He turned to his assistant and said something quietly. Elena caught fragments. She's here. Northbridge nodded. Good. Across the room, Ethan was still laughing, still performing, still trying to become the version of himself he believed this room wanted to see. He didn't know that the performance was about to end. And when the spotlight shifted, he would be the only one unprepared. The music in the ballroom shifted into a slower melody. No one said it aloud, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations grew shorter. Side glances came more quickly. Nods were no longer entirely unconscious. Elena remained on the balcony, the city lights reflecting off the glass, casting an unusual calm across her face. She wasn't standing there to hide. She stood there because there was no longer any reason to force herself into a place that had quietly removed her from its inner circle. Behind her, whispers began to take root. Is she that woman? I heard she's that guy's wife. Wife? I thought she was the help. The voices weren't loud, but they were loud enough for someone to hear, and loud enough for someone else to choose to believe. Elena heard everything. She didn't turn around, didn't frown, didn't sigh. There's a strange kind of strength in people who have been misunderstood many times. They no longer react instinctively to defend themselves. They observe. Across the room, Ethan was retelling an old story, embellishing it slightly to fit the setting. He didn't notice that fewer people were listening, not because the story was uninteresting, but because the reader's attention was shifting. A middle-aged woman leaned toward her companion and spoke softly. She carries a very different presence. Doesn't look like someone who just helps out. The other nodded. The way she stands, very self-possessed. Comments like these carried no malice, but they carried weight, because they raised a question this room was accustomed to avoiding. If that woman wasn't what he said she was, then who was he? Ethan laughed loudly at a joke, but the sound didn't spread. It fell into a space filled with eyes that were beginning to reconsider everything. A colleague leaned in. Your wife, what does she do? Ethan paused, just for a fraction of a second. Oh, he said, his voice quicker than usual. She mostly stays at home. The man nodded, but his eyes no longer trusted the answer. Right, he said. It's just, she doesn't seem like it. Ethan took a sip of his drink, his throat suddenly dry. Not because of the question, but because he had begun to realize he now needed to defend a story he had told. In another corner of the room, Elena drew the attention of a small group. Not because she sought it, but because perceptive people always notice those who don't need attention to exist. An older man with gray hair studied her for a moment before asking, Do you work in this field? Elena smiled, just enough. You could say I'm familiar with it. Familiar? To what extent? He asked, not probing, just curious. Elena paused for a beat, then replied, To the extent that I believe ethics are not a secondary component of strategy. The man smiled lightly. Few people say that here. Elena didn't respond. She hadn't come to persuade anyone. At the table, Ethan began to feel restless. He saw Elena being questioned, saw attentive nods, saw curious eyes. One part of him wanted to feel proud. The other wanted control. He stood and walked toward her. Are you okay? He asked, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. I'm fine, Elena replied. I think you should sit down and rest a bit, he continued, his voice low but firm. No need to talk so much. Elena looked at him, not angry, not argumentative, just looking. I'm fine, she repeated calmly. Ethan forced a smile and turned to the group. Sorry, he said. She's a bit tired. Elena didn't react, but someone in the group frowned. She doesn't look tired. The sentence landed softly, but it felt as if someone had just tugged the rug beneath Ethan's feet. The gala moved into its formal segment, the clink of cutlery against plates, small conversations are fading, eyes turning toward the stage. Ethan exhaled, as if this was the part he knew well. Speeches, thank yous, applause at the right moments. He didn't notice that Elena had left the balcony and taken a different position, closer to the stage, not because she wanted to, but because someone had deliberately made space for her. A young woman whispered to her friend, Is she about to go up there? I don't know, the other replied, but it feels like it. Ethan caught fragments of the exchange and turned around. Elena stood there, posture straight, hands loosely folded in front of her. A sense of unease washed over him. What are you doing there? He asked quietly. Elena turned. Standing. That's not where you should be, he said quickly, lowering his voice. I don't want you to be misunderstood. Elena looked at him, her gaze so calm it unsettled him. "Misunderstood about what?" she asked. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. No answer sounded right. Before he could say anything else, the music stopped completely. The lights softened. A host stepped onto the stage, introducing the next segment. Ethan turned toward the stage, his attention pulled away. In that moment, he didn't see an assistant approach Elena and whisper something very quietly. Elena nodded. Just a nod. But to those watching, it looked like a long-awaited signal. Eyes began to converge, not toward Ethan, but toward Elena. Someone whispered, "Is she going up?" "Maybe." Ethan felt his heart begin to race, not from excitement, but from loss of control. He turned back, searching for Elena. She stood there, composed, as if this moment were not a turning point but simply the proper alignment of time. Ethan started toward her, but the crowd began to shift. There was no longer a clear path. Voices around him echoed. "I hear she's critical. How important? Just watch." Ethan stopped. For the first time that night, he didn't know where he was supposed to stand. The stage lights brightened. The host smiled, microphone in hand. "Before we begin tonight's honors," he said, "we would like to introduce the person who will be accompanying you throughout the evening." A very brief pause. So brief it could have seemed like a technique, but Elena knew. Ethan did not. Yet. The person who helped shape the ethical vision behind our most critical projects. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He turned. Elena was being invited forward. No one pushed her, no one rushed her. She walked slowly, steadily. And in that moment, Ethan understood something too late. This room had never belonged to him. He had only been allowed to stand in it. And Elena, she had never needed permission. The music stopped completely. Not the kind of abrupt stop that startles, but a deliberate one, like a gentle hand drawing the attention of the entire room in the same direction. The chandeliers dimmed, the stage at the front gradually brightened. The host stood at center stage, his voice low and clear. "Before we move into the award segment, the leadership would like to take a moment to recognize a special individual, someone who has quietly shaped our most important decisions over the past year." Ethan stood in the middle of the room, the glass in his hand already empty without him realizing when. He didn't take another sip. His throat felt dry, as if his body understood what his mind had not yet accepted. "That individual," the host continued, "is not always in front of the camera. But it is her composure and principles that have kept our major steps from drifting off their foundation." A very brief pause. Not long enough to invite doubt, just long enough to focus every gaze. Ethan turned his head, instinctively searching for Elena. She stood near the steps leading up to the stage, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. Not tense, not waiting, simply standing in the right place. "Please join me in applauding," the host said. "Tonight's host and the ethical advisor for Northbridge Capital Group's international projects," a beat, "Elena Fernandez-Walker." The room froze. There was no immediate murmur, no sudden reaction, only a collective silence, as if everyone needed a second to rearrange the story in their minds. Ethan felt his hands grow cold. Not from fear, but from disorientation. Elena stepped onto the stage, not rushed, not delayed. Each step sounded clearly against the wooden floor, not heavy, not light, like the heartbeat of someone who does not need to prove anything. A few whispers began to scatter among the tables. "She's an advisor? His wife?" The questions did not seek immediate answers. They sought acknowledgement. Ethan stood motionless. He couldn't remember whether he had stood up or not, couldn't remember where he was. He remembered only one thing with sharp clarity. his own words from hours earlier. "She helps me take care of things at home." The sentence now echoed in his mind, not loud, but constant, like dripping water in an empty room. Elena took the microphone from the host. She stood tall and looked across the room, not searching for anyone, not avoiding anyone, just looking, like someone accustomed to speaking truth in spaces that are not always ready to hear it. "Thank you, everyone," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "It is an honor to stand here tonight." Applause followed, not thunderous, but sincere. "There are contributions," Elena continued, "that do not take place on a stage. Those are not credited. That never appears in internal newsletters." She paused briefly. "But it is those contributions that keep major decisions from losing their direction." Ethan felt his heartbeat slow, not from calm, but because every word she spoke placed him exactly where truth stood. "Throughout my work," Elena said, "I have learned that leadership is not about speaking louder than others, and power is not about making someone else smaller so you can appear larger." A few people lowered their heads, a few looked up. Ethan could do neither. "I believe," she continued, "that dignity does not lie in how we are introduced, but in how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching." There was no applause immediately. The room held its silence as if everyone were checking where those words landed within themselves. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He looked at Elena, and for the first time that night, he did not see his wife. He saw a woman standing fully in her own space, borrowing no light, leaning on no one's title. Someone he had loved, but had never truly seen. "There are people," Elena went on, "we unintentionally overlook, not because they are unimportant, but because we are too busy proving that we are." She did not look at Ethan. She did not need to. "So tonight," Elena concluded, "I raise a glass to quiet strength, to humility, and to respect, something that should never be conditional." Applause erupted, this time louder, longer, not explosive, but unanimous. Ethan sat down, or perhaps he had never stood. He was no longer sure. Around him, the room came alive in a different way. The eyes that had once looked at him with curiosity now looked with reassessment. A colleague leaned over and said softly, half joking, half serious, "Your wife. She's impressive." Ethan did not reply. Another man looked directly at him, his tone unmasked. "Do you know what the hardest part is? It's not that you didn't know who she was." Ethan turned toward him. "It's that you were comfortable making her smaller." The sentence didn't need to be raised. It fell and stayed. On the stage, Elena handed the microphone back and offered the host a gentle smile. An older man, Richard Northbridge, stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder with a pride that required no explanation. Ethan watched and realized another truth. He hadn't just lost face. He had lost the only person who had ever seen him when he had nothing to perform. Elena stepped down from the stage. The crowd immediately flowed toward her. Handshakes, compliments, questions. She received them all with composure, holding none, pushing none away. As she passed Ethan, the distance between them narrowed to just a few steps. For a very brief second, Ethan thought she would stop, look at him, say something. But she didn't. She walked past, her familiar scent lingering for a moment, then disappeared into the crowd. There is no punishment heavier than no longer being the center of the gaze of the person who once loved you. Ethan sat there, in his expensive tuxedo, in the middle of a glittering room, and for the first time that night, for the first time in years, he felt tiny. Not because anyone had made him that way, but because he had just seen himself under light that no longer shielded him. And that light was not gentle at all. The applause was still echoing as Elena stepped off the stage. It wasn't festive or chaotic. It had rhythm. It had weight. As if the entire room had silently agreed on something without needing to say it aloud. Ethan remained seated. He didn't stand, didn't clap late, didn't try to merge himself into the wave of admiration. He sat there, back straight, hands resting on his thighs, like someone who had just had the last layer of clothing stripped away in the middle of winter, with no time to react. Around him, the party continued, but it no longer revolved around him. Groups shifted, broke apart, reformed along new lines. Conversations changed topics. Eyes passed over Ethan, not unkindly, but differently. A colleague from his department sat down beside him, voice low. "You okay?" Ethan nodded, out of habit. "Yeah," a familiar answer. But this time, it was hollow. The colleague looked at him for a few seconds, then stood up. No pat on the shoulder, no advice. He walked away, as if understanding that there are moments that don't require comfort. Ethan watched him go and realized an uncomfortable truth. No one was trying to embarrass him further. He had already completed that task himself. Across the room, Elena was speaking with a few older guests. She smiled, listened, and responded just enough. No boasting, no apologizing for her presence. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see a social gap between them. He saw an internal one. A distance built from all the times he spoke for her, the times he adjusted her to make her fit, the times he chose his own safety over her dignity. He stood up. His legs trembled slightly, not much, but enough for him to notice that his body was reacting to something he had avoided all evening. Responsibility. He walked past the tables, avoiding eye contact, unhurried. This time, he wasn't performing. As he approached the group Elena was standing with, one of the men turned, looked at Ethan, then at Elena. His gaze wasn't hostile, just clear. Elena turned. Her eyes met Ethan's. Not cold, not angry, just distant. "Maria," Ethan stopped himself. He took a breath. "Elena," he corrected. She nodded, as if accepting the correction, but it didn't bring her any closer to him. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked. Not pleading, not commanding, just a very ordinary question. Elena looked at the people around her, then back at him. "All right," she said, "for a moment." They stepped away from the main area into a small hallway behind the stage. The lighting was softer there, the music more distant, and for the first time that night, they had no audience. Ethan spoke first, like someone afraid that if the silence lasted too long, his courage would dissolve. I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know you." Elena raised her hand gently. "Don't start with that." Ethan stopped. "It's not that you didn't know," she continued, her voice calm. "It's that you never asked." The words weren't sharp, but they cut very deep. Ethan swallowed. "I love you," he said quickly, as if afraid the words would lose their validity if delayed even a second. "I never wanted to hurt you." Elena looked at him for a long time. "I believe you," she said, "and that's what makes it sad." Ethan frowned. "If you never wanted to hurt me," she continued, "then it wouldn't have been so easy." He had no answer, because deep down, he knew. When he introduced her as something that could be diminished, he hadn't hesitated. "I thought I was protecting us," Ethan said quietly. "I was afraid they'd see me differently." Elena nodded. "And you chose to let them see me differently." The silence stretched. Not heavy, just honest. "I didn't know you were that important to the company," Ethan added weakly. Elena tilted her head. Important? To whom? Ethan said nothing. Ethan, she said softly, saying his name. The problem isn't that you didn't know what my role was. She looked directly into his eyes. The problem is that you assumed I didn't have one. The words made him take a half step back. I never needed you to show me off, Elena continued. I only needed you not to hide me. Ethan closed his eyes. He wanted to apologize, wanted to say all the right words, but he realized those words were too familiar, and she had heard them too many times in too many forms. What should I do now? He asked, his voice nearly breaking. Elena exhaled slowly. You should leave the party early, she said, not as a punishment. He looked up. But as a way to protect yourself, she continued. Because the longer you stay, the more likely you are to turn regret into just another performance. The truth of it hurt, because it was accurate. Will you come home with me? Ethan asked. Elena answered immediately without hesitation. No. The answer wasn't cold, not angry, just clear. I need to stay, she added, and I need you to respect that. Ethan nodded. No argument, no pleading. He understood that if he tried to pull her back now, he would be doing the very thing that had brought them here. We'll talk later, Elena said. At home. It wasn't a promise, just a door not fully closed. Ethan turned away. Each step he took down that hallway felt heavier than the last, not because anyone was holding him back, but because he was walking alone, without any shielding left. When he passed through the ballroom one final time, no one noticed. No one turned to look. And in that moment, Ethan understood something he had avoided all evening. Being ignored doesn't hurt as much as realizing you deserve to be ignored. Outside the venue, cold air filled his lungs. The city was still bright, cars still moved. Nothing had collapsed except something invisible but essential. He got into the car and took the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the tuxedo was still perfect, unwrinkled, flawless. But the man wearing it was no longer intact. Ethan sat there for a long time without starting the engine, and for the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about how others would see him. He was thinking about a different question, slow, unforgiving. Who had he become that making the person he loved smaller had felt like safety? The apartment was darker than usual, not because the lights were off, but because something familiar was missing. Ethan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The sound of it shutting was soft, yet it echoed in his head for a long time. The tuxedo was still on his body, but now it carried no meaning beyond its weight. He stood still for a moment, as if moving would truly cause everything to collapse. There was no music, no clink of spoons against bowls. No, Elena asked if he was hungry. Only the original silence, the kind that doesn't accuse but also doesn't allow escape. Ethan took off his jacket and draped it over a chair. It fell crookedly, not neat like it usually was. He didn't fix it. Before, he always did, always adjusted, always needed everything to look fine, even when nothing inside was. He walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, not leaning back, not relaxing, like someone waiting to be called into an interrogation room. His phone buzzed, a message from a colleague. Tonight was unexpected. He didn't reply. Another message. Hope you're okay. He placed the phone face down on the table, not out of anger, but because for the first time, he didn't want to be comforted. He lifted his head and looked around the apartment. Everything was the same. The lamp Elena liked because of its soft light. The rug they bought on a spontaneous trip. The books were neatly lined on the shelves, most of them hers. Ethan realized something. He had been living in a space created by a woman he had never once asked what she had set aside to be here. He stood up and walked into the bedroom. The bed was empty. Elena's pillow was still neatly placed, but there was no warmth, no familiar scent. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on the blanket. In his mind, the words from the gala repeated themselves, but now they were no longer muffled by music or laughter. She helps me take care of things at home. He closed his eyes, not from shame, but because he had just heard himself through someone else's ears, and that voice was not a good one. The door opened very softly. Ethan startled and stood up. Elena stepped inside. She held her shoes in her hand, barefoot, as if she didn't want to bring any unnecessary noise into the apartment. She placed the shoes neatly by the wall, then set her bag on the table. Every movement was slow, controlled, not because she was tired, but because she didn't want emotion to fracture this space. Ethan stepped toward her. Elena. She raised her hand gently. Not yet, she said. Just one word, but Ethan stopped immediately. Elena walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, drank slowly. Only then did she turn back to him. Sit down, she said. Not a command, but not a suggestion either. Ethan sat. She remained standing. Between them was a distance, close enough to feel, but not close enough to touch or escape. You want to know why I never told you about myself, Elena began, her voice calm. I'll tell you, but you have to listen. No interruptions, no explanations, no defending yourself. Ethan nodded at once. I promise. Elena took a deep breath. Before I met you, she said, I had a different life. Ethan watched her, not looking away. I studied law, worked in investment and corporate ethics, not to prove anything, but because I liked it. She paused briefly. Then my mother got sick. Her voice didn't change, but Ethan felt the weight of the memory. I left my job, took care of her full-time. 2 years of hospitals, medication, long nights no one ever saw. Ethan swallowed. He knew her mother had passed away, but he had never asked what that loss had done to her. When my mother died, Elena continued, I was empty, as if I had completed the only role I knew. She looked directly at him, and that's when you appeared. Ethan exhaled softly. You were kind, she said. You asked real questions. You listened. You didn't rush to fix me, to make me fit. She smiled faintly. I thought you were trying. Ethan closed his eyes. I didn't talk about my past, Elena continued, because I didn't want my love to be built on titles. She tilted her head. I wanted to be loved when I had nothing to show. Ethan opened his eyes. But then you changed, she said. Not suddenly, not obviously, just you started speaking for me, deciding for me, adjusting me. She paused. And I realized you didn't love me less. You just began to fear how others would see you through me. Ethan lowered his head. I didn't say anything, Elena went on, because I wanted to see what you would do when you thought you had the right. There was no anger in her voice, only truth. And tonight, she said quietly, you gave me my answer. Ethan trembled. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know I had become that person. Elena looked at him. You didn't become, she said. You revealed. That hurt him more than any accusation. I don't need you to hate yourself, Elena continued. I need you to look at yourself. Ethan nodded, tears falling. What do I need to do? He asked. Elena was silent for a long time. Then she said, First, I need space. Ethan looked up. Not as punishment, she said, but so I don't have to protect myself from my own husband. The sentence hung in the room. I don't know what the future looks like, Elena continued. I'm tired, and I need quiet. Ethan nodded. I understand. Elena turned and walked toward the guest bedroom. Before closing the door, she stopped. Ethan, she said. He looked up. Don't try to fix things to earn forgiveness, she said. Fix them because if you don't, you'll keep hurting the people you say you love. Then she closed the door, gently. No lock, no drama, just a boundary being set. Ethan remained seated, alone. No one left to perform for, no story left to tell. Only one question that wouldn't let him turn away. If there were no image, no gazes, no recognition, who was he then? And for the first time, he didn't search for an answer to say aloud. He sat there and let it reach him. The morning after that night arrived very slowly. Not because the clock was wrong, but because time, when there was no one left to avoid, suddenly moved in step with every breath. Ethan woke up on the couch. His shirt was still on, wrinkles layered over wrinkles like a map of sleepless hours. Light slipped through the curtains, illuminating the familiar room in a very different way. Not gentle, not warm, but exposed. He sat up, his head heavy. The door to the guest bedroom was still closed. No sound, no sign of whether Elena was awake or not. Ethan didn't knock. For the first time, he understood that not every distance needs to be filled immediately. Some distances must be respected if you don't want to turn regret into yet another act of intrusion. In the kitchen, the kettle was still slightly warm. A mug sat on the table, traces of a morning already past. Elena had been here, then left without leaving a note. Ethan stared at the mug for a long time, not because he missed her, but because he realized absence has a shape. He opened his phone. A stream of messages appeared. Colleagues, friends, questions, half concerned, half curious. He didn't reply. Instead, he typed into the search bar, "Therapist near me." His finger paused for a few seconds, not out of hesitation, but because part of him still wanted to prove something, that he could fix himself, that with enough discipline, enough remorse, everything would be fine. Then he remembered Elena's words from the night before. Don't fix things to earn forgiveness. He chose the earliest available appointment, without thinking further, without waiting for his emotions to settle, without waiting until this became a better story to tell. The therapy room was small and quiet. No inspirational artwork, no soothing essential oil scent, just an armchair, a coffee table, and a middle-aged woman whose voice did not try to comfort. What brings you here? She asked. Ethan opened his mouth, then stopped. He could talk about the gala, about the humiliation, about how his wife was someone he had never truly seen. But instead, he said, I made someone I love smaller. The room fell silent. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the type that lets a sentence sit where it is. Why? The woman asked. Ethan shrugged, a dry smile on his face. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? He thought for a long time. Afraid they would see me through her, he said. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of not being enough. Not enough for whom? She asked. Ethan paused. He had never asked himself that question seriously. For the people who get to decide, he answered, uncertain. For the room. The woman tilted her head. Then why didn't you say, this is my wife? Ethan looked down at his hands. Because I was afraid that if they saw her as an equal, they would see me as less. As soon as the words left his mouth, Ethan felt as if someone had yanked a curtain aside inside his mind. The woman didn't react immediately. She only asked, "When did you learn that?" The question allowed no escape. The first image that surfaced in Ethan's mind was an old bathroom mirror, weak yellow light, and his father standing in front of it, adjusting a worn tie. "If you don't look important, people will treat you like you aren't," Ethan told her, about the parties where his father spoke too loudly, the times he came home angry from being looked down on. The lesson that poverty wasn't just about lacking money, but also about lacking the right to be respected. "And you believed it?" the woman said. "No," Ethan shook his head. "I lived by it." He sat there, realizing he had built an entire self around avoiding being looked down on. And to do that, he had learned to look down on others first. The session ended without a climax. No long advice, just one sentence. Awareness is the first step. Staying with it is the hard part. In the days that followed, the apartment began to function on a new rhythm. Elena wasn't cold. She didn't start fights. She stopped compensating. She didn't remind him to eat, didn't manage schedules, didn't ask how his day was. Ethan realized how accustomed he had been to being taken care of, not because he was spoiled, but because things were carried for him. He began doing small things he had never paid attention to before: washing dishes, taking out the trash, scheduling appointments himself, taking responsibility for his own emotions. No one praised him, no one acknowledged it, and for the first time, he understood. He had expected rewards for the bare minimum of respect. One afternoon, he saw Elena getting ready to go to work. She dressed, but her posture was steadier than before. Something in her had returned, not loudly, but clearly. "Can I drive you?" Ethan asked. Elena paused for a beat. "No need," she said. "I have a car." The answer wasn't a rejection. It was a new boundary. Ethan nodded. "Okay." He didn't explain, didn't try to pull her back. He learned not to turn every moment into an opportunity for redemption. That evening, Ethan opened a blank notebook. No quotes, no goals, just a white page. He wrote, "What did I want to do today to feel bigger?" The answers made him uncomfortable. Interrupt when Elena was praised. Tell others I'm changing. Be seen. He underlined the last line. Be seen. He remembered Elena's eyes on the stage, not needing to be seen, not needing to be validated, just being herself. A week later, the therapist suggested a simple task. Go somewhere where no one knows who you are, and stay long enough to feel uncomfortable. Ethan chose a volunteer center near the neighborhood where he had met Elena years ago. On the first day, the supervisor handed him gloves and a mop. "Bathrooms," she said. "If it's not a good fit, just say so." Ethan nodded. He mopped floors, scrubbed sinks, collected trash. No one asked his name. No one cared what he did for a living. His back ached, his hands burned. And in that exhaustion, he realized something strange. He didn't disappear when no one was watching. He stopped performing. When he got home, Elena asked softly, "What did you do today?" Ethan replied, "I learned how to be quiet." Elena looked at him. Her gaze didn't soften immediately, but it didn't close either. "Quiet for what?" she asked. "To listen," he said. "Not to others, but to myself, when I'm not being noticed." Elena nodded, very slightly. Not forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that something was shifting. That night, Ethan lay on the couch staring at the ceiling. There was no longer the urgency to become someone else, only a slow, unimpulsive desire to become someone who doesn't need to make others smaller to feel enough. And for the first time, that desire wasn't directed at Elena. It was directed at himself. The cafe Elena chose sat on a quiet street corner. No large sign, no music turned up too loud, just natural light slanting through the glass windows and the smell of freshly roasted coffee, strong enough to be present, but not enough to drown out the scent of time. Ethan arrived early, not to signal eagerness, but because he didn't want to make Elena wait. He chose a table near the window and wrapped both hands around a hot cup of tea. No phone, no script running through his head. He sat there, breathing slowly, allowing his body to relax. When Elena walked in, Ethan stood up out of old reflex. Elena lifted her hand slightly. "You don't need to stand." Ethan paused halfway, then sat back down. "Right," he said. "I forgot." Elena sat across from him. She placed her bag on the chair beside her, no leaning back, no crossed arms. The posture of someone present, but not fully open. They sat in silence for a few seconds. Not the awkward kind, but the kind shared by two people, adjusting their breathing so they don't step into each other's space. "Thank you for coming," Elena said first. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Ethan replied. Elena nodded. "I'm not here to hear apologies," she said. "I'm here for clarity." Ethan nodded immediately. "I understand." The server came over. Elena ordered tea. Ethan ordered the same, not to mirror her, but because he no longer felt the need to create difference. When the server left, Elena looked directly at him. "I want to ask you one question," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, without editing." Ethan swallowed. "Okay." "What do you think has changed?" Elena asked. "Not in me, in you." Ethan was silent for a long time. He had thought he was prepared for this conversation, but that question didn't allow for smooth answers. "I'm still the same person," he said slowly. "I still have the same reflexes. Still moments when I want to be seen, praised, to be more." Elena didn't interrupt. "But what's different," Ethan continued, "is that now I recognize when I'm doing it." He looked down at his tea. "And I no longer use other people to soothe that feeling." Elena tilted her head. "Give me an example." Ethan nodded. "At work," he said, "I've started acknowledging others, even when it makes me disappear from the conversation." He smiled faintly. "Before, that would have felt unsafe." Elena watched him, not quick to believe. "And at home?" she asked. Ethan took a breath. "At home, I stopped looking for reactions from you." She met his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I no longer tell you about things I do just to be recognized," he said. "I don't wait for praise. I don't wait to hear, 'You did great.'" He looked up. "Because if I need that to keep respecting you, then that respect was never real." Elena didn't answer right away. The server brought the tea. Steam rose gently, softening the space between them. "Elena," Ethan continued, his voice lower, "I didn't come here to ask you to go back to how things were." She looked at him, slightly surprised. "I don't want you to return to the role of protecting me from myself," he said. "I want a chance for you to see who I'm becoming." Elena took a sip of tea. "And if I don't want to watch?" she asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Then I still have to continue." That answer made Elena pause, not because she was moved, but because, for the first time, the answer didn't revolve around her. "Elena," Ethan added, "I know you don't owe me hope." She set her cup down. "That's right," she said. "I don't owe you anything." They sat there, in a city that paid no attention to their small conversation. "I'll tell you where I am," Elena said, "but I'm not promising anything." Ethan nodded. "I'm not ready to return to the marriage as it was," she said. "Not out of anger, but because I don't want to become a version of myself that has to shrink to keep the peace." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. "I understand. But," Elena continued, "I'm not closing the door." He opened his eyes. "I'm willing to rebuild," she said, "but slowly, with boundaries, and with no guarantees." Ethan exhaled, as if setting down a weight he never should have carried in the first place. "Thank you," he said. Elena raised her hand. "Don't thank me," she said. "This isn't a reward." He nodded. "I know." They talked a bit longer, not about the gala, not about the hurt. They talked about small things, the new work Elena was doing, a mentorship program for young women, books she was rereading after many years. Ethan listened. No excessive nodding, no inserting his own stories. When Elena stood up to leave, Ethan stood as well, this time slower, more intentional. He didn't reach out, didn't seek closeness. He walked with her to the door. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted across the sidewalk. Life continued. Not waiting for anyone to finish fixing themselves. "Elena," Ethan said as she was about to turn away. She turned back. "I want you to know one thing," he said. "I'm not trying to become someone worthy of you." She frowned slightly. "I'm trying to become someone who doesn't hurt anyone that way anymore." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then she nodded. "That's a starting point," she said. No hug, no hand-holding, just a very quiet acknowledgement. Ethan stood there watching her blend into the crowd. No panic, no emptiness, just a strange but right feeling. Hope, when not forced, can stand on its own. He went home that evening and didn't turn on the overhead lights. He turned on only the table lamp Elena used to like, the soft light, unjudging. He opened his notebook. He wrote, "Today, I didn't try to hold anyone back. And for the first time, that feels like the right direction." He closed the notebook. Outside, the city lights came on. Not for him. Not for Elena. And for the first time, Ethan felt that this was not frightening at all. The next gala took place on an early winter evening. The city still shimmered as it always had. Luxury cars still lined up at the entrance. Elegant gowns still reflected the lights like carefully polished promises. Nothing had changed. Except Ethan. He arrived early, not to be seen, but to avoid intruding on anyone else's moment. The suit he wore fit well, but it was simple. No expensive watch, no attention-grabbing tie. Just the clothes of someone who came to be in the right place, nothing more. He found a seat a few rows back, not the center, not the edge, a position just sufficient to observe without needing to be observed. When Elena entered, the room shifted subtly, not because of whispers, but because of natural attention. She didn't need to pause, didn't need to signal. She needed to be present. Elena wore a minimalist, deep blue dress, no extravagance, no ornamentation. Yet every step carried a distinct rhythm, the rhythm of someone who doesn't need permission to occupy her own space. Ethan saw her, and what surprised him most was that he didn't feel pain. No tightening in his chest, no panic, no urge to stand, to prove something, to remind anyone that that's my wife. He felt something unfamiliar instead. Respect, without possession. Elena stepped onto the stage when her name was announced. No one introduced her through a relationship. No one attached her to any man. Only this. Tonight's keynote speaker. And that was enough. Her speech wasn't long. She didn't speak of victories. She didn't recount wounds. She spoke of things rarely mentioned in rooms of power. The quiet labor of those who support from the background. The right decisions that don't earn immediate applause. And one truth that seems obvious, yet remains rare. Respect is not what we display when there is an audience. It is how we treat the people closest to us, when we believe no one is watching. Ethan listened to every word, not as someone being admonished, but as someone who had finally learned the language of himself. When the applause came, Ethan clapped as well. Not loudly, not quickly, just enough to reflect the agreement inside him. He didn't look around to see who noticed. There was no need. After the program, people gathered to congratulate Elena. Questions, praise, invitations. She received them all with her familiar composure. Ethan stood, but he didn't move toward her. He knew this was not his moment. He left the gala early, not to avoid anything, but because he had learned when to step back so as not to occupy someone else's space. Outside, the cold air touched his skin, sharp and real. He walked for a short while without checking his phone, letting the city pass by. He thought of the man he had been a year earlier, the man who believed he had to make someone smaller to stand tall, the man who confused being respected with being feared. And for the first time, Ethan didn't hate that man. He took responsibility. Life afterwards didn't turn into a fairy tale. Elena and Ethan didn't go back to how things were. They rebuilt differently. There were days Elena stayed out late, days Ethan didn't know what to say. But one thing no longer happened. No one had to shrink to keep the peace. One evening they sat down to eat together. No flattering lights, no background music. Elena talked about a young mentee in her program, a bright girl who always apologized before speaking. Ethan listened. "She reminds me of myself back then," Elena said. Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought. "I was like that too," he said. "I just chose to be loud, to hide it." Elena looked at him. No blame, no praise, just recognition. Another day, Ethan declined an opportunity to speak on behalf of a colleague during a meeting. He passed the microphone, even though it meant no one would remember his name. He went home without mentioning it, didn't need acknowledgement, and when he realized that, he smiled. A few months later, Elena set a cup of tea in front of him. "I talk about a university," she said. "I don't need you to come." Ethan nodded. "I know." She looked up, slightly surprised. "But if you want," she added, "you can sit in the back." Ethan looked at her. "I want to," he said, "but not to be seen." Elena smiled. Not a big smile, just a very real one. At the talk, Ethan sat in the last row. No one knew who he was, no one asked. He sat there listening to Elena speak about ethics, about power, about not confusing silence with weakness. He absorbed it, not to repeat, but to live with. When people began to leave, Ethan didn't go up to the stage. He let Elena have her moment. On the way home, they walked side by side, no hand-holding, no distance, just matching pace. "Elena," Ethan said as they stopped at an intersection. She turned. "Thank you," he said. She frowned slightly. "For what?" "For not turning your pain into a loud lesson," he said, "and for letting me learn quietly." Elena looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't do it for you. I did it for myself." Ethan nodded. "And that's why," he said, "it was able to change me." This story doesn't end with a kiss in the rain, not with lifelong promises. It ends with something smaller, but stronger. Two people standing side by side without anyone needing to become smaller for the other to grow. And if you've listened this far, perhaps you've realized something too. We don't hurt others because we are bad. We do it because we are afraid. But fear is not a sentence. It is an invitation to look again, to pause, and to learn how to respect even when no one is watching. Some stories don't teach us how to win. They teach us how not to lose ourselves. If this story made you reflect, like it to help it spread. Share it so someone who needs it can find it, and comment. Do you see yourself in Ethan or in Elena? Subscribe to Deep Life Tales to continue journeying with stories of dignity, awakening, and real change when no one is watching. See you in the following story.